Welcome to Connecticut Yankee Sanity. Today, in the wake of the recent psychopathic rampages in El Paso and Dayton, we'll talk about gun violence. The term domestic terrorism has been introduced into the debate over these incidents, but there's disagreement. Terrorism has a definite political connotation, and it's not always evident that the perpetrator's motives are political. In these two recent instances, they may have been. The one murderer was an Antifa radical, the other a right-wing psychopath consumed by hatred of illegals. By contrast, in the case of a Stephen Paddock, the Las Vegas gunman, or an Adam Lanza, the Sandy Hook school assassin, there was a desire to make a public statement, but it seems unlikely that the murderers acted out of conscious political motives. Until this question is sorted out by the experts, it seems best to stick with gun violence as the operative term. Each fresh instance of multiple murders in public using firearms triggers renewed calls by the left to restrict private gun ownership, if not to abolish it. President Trump is condemned for the deaths and the NRA for standing in the way of reform. It's a familiar litany. Gun control advocates say we ought to follow Australia's example and disarm the population. They echo the 19th century Women's Christian Temperance Union's stance on alcohol. Guns are evil, immoral, a cause of harm to the innocent and the defenseless, an aid to crime, a means of suicide. The WCTU's agitation led to the passage in 1919 of the 18th Amendment, outlawing the manufacture, distribution, and sale of alcohol. Gun control inversely might start with the repeal of the Second Amendment, followed by legislation similar to the Volstead Act to ban the sale of guns and ammunition as well as their ownership, except by the government. The last serious attempts to do this were in 1992 and 1993 by New York Congressman Major Owens. "I'm all alone on this one," he told the press at the time. He still would be. The country doesn't want guns solely in the possession of the government and criminals. It's reluctant to deny them to millions of responsible owners, as prohibition denied alcohol to millions of responsible drinkers. You may be taken aback by what I'll say next, and I'm sorry for that, although I'm hardly the first to make the observation. The murders committed in Las Vegas, Sandy Hook, Columbine, Parkland, and now El Paso and Dayton are statistically insignificant compared to other ways in which innocent lives are horrifically extinguished. I emphasize that there's no disrespect or lack of compassion in that observation for family members and friends or injured survivors. No human being, except capable of committing such murders, would fail to feel outrage and sympathy for those affected. The deaths are nonetheless dwarfed statistically by those caused by drunk driving. According to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, 10,497 in 2016 alone. Last weekend, the two gunmen in El Paso and Dayton murdered 31 people. But 30 people on average die every day in drunk driving crashes. But these fatalities, you may say, aren't premeditated murder. Fair enough, but are we to believe that the drunk driver doesn't realize he's willfully endangering others? That his decision to drive drunk isn't premeditated? Yes, but cars are built for transportation, not for killing. Again, fair enough. But the London-based Risk Advisory Group reported that, quote, vehicles used as improvised weapons became the single most lethal form of attack in Western countries for the first time in 2016. Just over half of the terrorism-related deaths that year in the West were the result of vehicle ramming attacks. Unquote. The conclusion is that if your intention is to commit multiple murders and inflict injuries on as many of those not killed as possible, guns are not the only, or even necessarily the most convenient option. The left's focus, however, is on guns. I suspect this has to do with the kind of people who typically own them. Law and order types who wish to defend themselves and their families against criminals. People who hunt wild animals. Survivalists with siege mentalities. Reprobates who listen to Rush Limbaugh. And of course, all Trump supporters. Why else would the left exploit the shock and grief surrounding, say, a school shooting to promote abolishing gun ownership? but not do likewise with vehicle ramming crimes. When Sayfullo Saipov ran down a group of people on a sidewalk in New York in 2017, there was no March on Washington, no candlelit all-night vigils, and no calls for vehicle control legislation or stricter background checks on people applying for licenses or buying cars. No one that I know of went on CNN or NPR to protest the presence of 286 million cars in private hands that at any moment might be used to run down innocent people on the streets. The sad truth for the left, and for all of us, is that if overnight it were possible to ban the sale of guns and confiscate all firearms and ammunition, if the Second Amendment were repealed and burned in a televised ceremony on the White House lawn, it wouldn't prevent a single mass shooting. Like it or not, the United States is an arsenal. Estimates run as high as 300 million firearms in private hands. The owners of these weapons are unlikely to relinquish them, voluntarily or otherwise. Even criminals and psychopaths know better than to do that. How then, in practical terms, might gun control be implemented? Since guns and not the criminals are considered the main problem, it's only right that gun owners should finance reform. The first step could be to impose an annual federal firearms tax. Adding a checkbox to Form 1040, as with Obamacare, would provide the tracking mechanism. Each taxpayer would declare under penalty of law whether he owned guns, and if so, list them on a separate schedule, calculate the tax, and add it to his bill. The IRS now has a record of gun owners and their guns. Next, the government raises the tax to a punitive level or offers a buyout program, as the Australians did. In the end, to own a gun, except if you're a thief or a murderous maniac, might no longer be worth it. Repealing the Second Amendment might not even be necessary. Do I make my point? The main thing is gun control, not preventing crime, since, as everyone knows, preventing crime is impossible. In the aftermath of these latest shootings, Senator Lindsey Graham has proposed legislation to make preemptively identifying and isolating possible gunmen easier. It's a positive step. That telltale signs of pending violence are often ignored or overlooked is practically a byword. A kid's room can be an arsenal, but the parents do nothing about it, rationalizing that boys will be boys. Messages posted on Facebook that he intends to murder his teachers and classmates or direct a fusillade against the occupants of a shopping mall is no reason to overreact. Similarly, a nutcase broadcasts his homicidal intentions, but were reluctant to confiscate his weapons and put him in a padded cell. No, the gun control folks are convinced that the only real solution is to ferret out every last firearm and bullet in the country and confiscate them. This is perhaps an understandable overreaction to atrocious crimes committed by people who might better never have been born. Emotion easily prevails over reason and facts in such circumstances. But according to a report published in January 2018 by the Pew Research Center, quote, violent crime has been declining in the U.S. for the past 25 years. Public perceptions about crime, however, don't often align with the data. Opinion surveys regularly find that Americans believe crime is up nationally, even when the data show it is down. Unquote. Gun control in that light might well be a solution looking for a problem rather than the other way around. In any case, gun control advocates, if successful, will most likely end up reliving the legacy of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. 14 years after it was passed, the 18th Amendment was repealed. While it was in force, ordinary citizens by the tens of millions became criminals, and Al Capone and his fellow mafiosi never had it so good. Thanks for watching. Please click like, subscribe, and pass the link along to support the channel. We'll see you back here next time when the topic will be internet censorship.